Good day, friends, colleagues. Thank you for this time that we can take together and just share briefly on my chapter. I focused on Mark Maddox's chapter, The Church as Confessional Educator, Catechism Approach to Christian Education. Mark Maddox, as he reflects on this idea of a catechetical Christian education, points out that the role of the Christian education is central to the church. Maddox acknowledged the different traditions of faith and the churches that plays a faithful role in discipleship, as he acknowledged that Christian education is a very central role within the church. However, he points out that many of these traditions do not provide a holistic approach as it relates to Christian education. Maddox point out that the Church of Nazarene, which have its roots in Wesleyan holiness tradition, and the reason he's pointing that out, it's because he also want to point out that there's been various struggles with the development of a holistic approach due to approaching Christian education with the emphasis of revivalism and instantaneous experience. Maddox point out, even though the Nazarene struggled, he still believes there is a holistic approach to Christian education found in John Wesley's theology. According to Maddox, John Wesley, as a practical theologian, understood the need to establish Christian educational practices that aided people to grow towards holiness of heart and life. And so the idea of a catechetical idea of Christian education that is holistic, he points out, is to grow individuals in holiness of heart and life. And so this catechetical Christian education, or this idea of Wesley of catechism, catechesis is the process by which Christians are formed, educated, and instructed. And he believes that as he looked to Wesley's theology and how Wesley saw this catechesis idea was how does through Christian education, how is Christian formed and how they instructed. According to John Westerhoff, that Maddox point out, Westerhoff says this idea of a catechesis idea of education, Christian education, the activity is to transmit the church's tradition, number one, but number two, it is to enable faith to become living. And so Westerhoff points out that this catechism that's supposed to transform and educate and instruct, its purpose is for to transfer the tradition of the church, but also to enable faith to become a living. And so the catechetical approach for Christian education is reflected in John Wesley's focus on the means of grace. And we'll see how he used this means of grace as interchangeably with the word ordinance, as he believes that God intended it to be this way as he looks at John Wesley's focus and idea. He points out that Wesley uses the word means with the word ordinance, as I've just pointed out on occasion, as an indicator that participation was expected from the believer, and so the means of grace comes to this ordinance idea that participation from God was expected from all of us. And so this whole idea of catechism as it relates to Christian education, and and Wesley's focus on the means of grace to approach this idea. Wesley divided the means of grace into three divisions, as he's going to try and put this idea together according to Maddox. The first one is the instructed means of grace, and we see this go back to the Methodist tradition, how the instruction took place for the believers, but also the prudential means of grace, and then the general means of grace that Maddox just pointed out. And in these three, how John Wesley see this catechesis or catechetical approach to Christian education, that has this instructional, this prudent, and this general idea. And so the instituted idea is practices given directly by Jesus, as Maddox pointed out. And this what it simply entails is that through the instituted means of grace is regards prayer, the searching of scriptures, practicing the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, fasting, and Christian conferencing, spiritual education or conversation, pardon me. And this is the first point that Maddox pointed out, that Wesley, having these three ideas as it relates to this catechism approach to Christian education. And so those are the elements that forms part of this instituted means of grace. And then number two, the prudential means of grace, according to Wesley, it's obeying Christ, it's being part of a small group, attending special prayer meetings. It was visiting the sick, doing good to people, reading from the devotional classics of the rich tradition of the 1,000 years of Christianity, was part of this prudential means of grace. Prudential were designed to meet the person at his or her point of need. As we've mentioned, how some of this prudential means of grace was visiting the sick, special prayer meetings. So there's a lot of action involved, as opposed to the first, the instituted one, where one observe the scriptures, one form part of prayer, one form part of fasting and spiritual conversations. And so we see how the prudential part is more involvement and participation. And then number three, the general means of grace, watching and denying ourselves, almost observing what one gets involved in, the conversations, what one participates in. And so there's that self-reflection component there that he points out in this general idea of means of grace. And then taking up our daily cross is what he also points out there as this general means of grace. And one, obviously, the biblical perspective of what does it mean to pick up daily one's cross. Exercising the presence of God is also just this general idea, almost this kind of more private space that one finds itself in, as there's a lot of self-reflection. Wesley didn't confine God's grace to these practices, and so out of these three, the instituted, the prudence, and then the general, he then further then developed these as he looks at this means of grace as an approach to this catechism idea of theological education, and having divided it into three, he then further divides it according to formation, discernment, and transformation. It's almost as if these three kind of have an interplay into when one look at the idea of instituted, and you look at the idea of the means and grace. And Wesley's categories of these graces, along with acts of mercy, suggests three complementary approaches to Christian education, and that is formation, it's discernment, and it's transformation. Formation, really participation on communal practices. It's not individualistic, such as worship, the Eucharist, small groups. To these communal practices, persons are socialized into that Christian faith, and becoming part of the Christian community. And that's where formation takes place of the believer, as the believer takes part of this. And he looks at the childhood formation being part of the whole formation process. And in one of his sermons, he points out just the responsibility and how God has entrusted this idea to the church of the formation. And the adult formation, small groups, once again, the small groups come in, how to become part of this small groups, and to get involved in that, and to participate. And then the bands was also, and all of these were part of Methodist practices. And so the bands were voluntary cells of people who professed a clear Christian faith and who desire to grow in love, holiness, and purity of intention. And so we see kind of that idea coming together there in regards to just the formation. And then worship as formation was one of the points that he pointed out as well. In regards to the discernment, begins with the awareness of God. And when one look at just the idea of this discernment, it is then approached through Scripture and trying to sense within it what God is saying, and he then ultimately would then conclude with transformational, educational transformational acts, which is evangelism, discipleship, and mission. Maddox, based on Wesley's means of grace, a holistic approach to Christian education can be best expressed through a catechetical process that include formation, discernment, and transformation. And having reflect on this chapter, we see how there's just this educational aspect, the instructional aspect that comes in, and then practicing that, and how the church can really take from this and continue in this tradition that would help and guide the church in fulfilling the Great Commission, as Christian education becomes a very central part of the church. And this, I assume in part of these practices, one then have to very critically, obviously, look at it with a cultural evaluation and analysis, as the Church of the Nazarene find itself globally. Some of these practices and some of these things can then be reviewed and then be looked at differently. Thank you very much.